The Dakota wind whipped across the prairie grasses like a cavalry saber, sharp and cold enough to seem capable of slicing the air itself in two. But beneath the slope of Ridge Hollow, in the thick packed earth, Eleanor Ward felt only the faintest thread of chill creeping along the stone wall. "They're up on the hill again," she said quietly, never taking her hands from the bread dough she was kneading on the rough wooden table. Through the small window cut into the dugout's front face, pale light fell on three mounted figures standing on the ridge about a quarter-mile away: Henry Cobb, Martha Dunn, and Joel Myers, residents of Marrow Creek, come once more to witness what they called the widow, living like a wild animal underground. Eleanor stood near the threshold of her dugout's entrance. The curved wooden door closed tight within the stone wall, the only part of the home visible from outside. Behind her, the entire structure burrowed more than 15 feet into the Dakota hillside, facing south, concealed beneath the winter grass. Overhead, the curved willow-ribbed roof vanished into the packed earth, invisible as though the house had never existed to the outside world. It was January 1888, and Eleanor had lived in this dugout for 4 months of whispers, mockery, and shunning from the other settlers who built log cabins above ground on the open plain and believed that was the only real house. "Let them look," Eleanor murmured, her eyes never leaving the dough, slowly smoothing under her hands. At 33, she had learned that the land never lies. It holds steady warmth, blocks wind, and protects those who know how to listen. One day, they'll understand. She did not know how soon that day would come, or how harshly the winter would teach them its lesson. In January 1885, 3 years before the Ridge Hollow dugout took shape, Eleanor Ward had stood beneath a storm that the people of Marrow Creek later called the night the wind sucked. Their log cabin shuddered like something gripped by the throat. The north-facing boards popped loose one by one, groaning long before being torn away down the slope. Isaac, her husband, a man who had lived his whole life amid the Great Plains winds, still believed that a few more roof braces would see the cabin through. He rushed outside as the storm shifted direction, carrying hammer and nails, trying to patch a section of roof being sucked upward as though something inside were yanking it back. Eleanor stood in the doorway, seeing only swirling snow and Isaac's shadow staggering each time the wind struck sideways. She heard something tear free from the roof, then a broken cry. When she reached him, Isaac lay motionless on the white snow, his face already purple after just minutes of exposure. Eleanor knelt, cradling him, feeling the wind not merely blowing but attacking living flesh, draining heat and life in seconds. That sensation never left her. One witnessing was enough to understand that no strong enough roof existed on Dakota land if it relied on wood and faith. 3 years later, in early spring 1887, standing alone on the Ridge Hollow slope looking down at the town, Eleanor decided that if she wanted to survive in this place, her house must rely on the earth, not fight against it. She spent 3 full weeks surveying the base of Ridge Hollow, walking slowly like someone measuring cropland. South-facing received the most winter sun, enough to reduce nighttime temperature swings. The hillside slope was even, not too steep, allowing natural drainage without rushing runoff. The loamy soil layer was about 2 feet thick before hitting hard clay soil she knew could hold relatively stable temperature across seasons. Near the base, a small spring emerged after the early April thaw, a sign the sod roof would stay moist enough to hold its structure through summer. She kept no notes, only looked, touched, dug up handfuls of soil, squinted into the wind, as though her body's memory had recorded everything learned from her husband's death. Everything carried the voice of an empiricist. The earth does not lie. After choosing the site, she began to dig. The excavation of the dugout took 4 to 5 weeks, depending on daylight hours and arm strength. Eleanor's tools were a small pick-matic, a worn-edged iron shovel, and 2 wooden buckets tied to rope to haul dirt up. She had no livestock to drag soil like the men in town, only her hands and the endurance built from years of farm work. The area she planned to dig was 18 feet wide, 26 feet deep, with an entrance set 14 feet below natural ground level. Each day, Eleanor dug 8 to 10 hours, depending on temperature. Loose soil moved quickly. Clay made every pick swing thud heavily, stinging her wrists. Her palms blistered in the first week, tore open in the second, and calloused by the third. For every foot of earth removed, she stepped back to tamp the dugout floor with a heavy wooden block. Thomas, her 9-year-old son, followed her whenever he wasn't doing odd jobs in town. The boy gathered small stones to line the dugout edges, stomped the leveled soil flat with his feet, and pulled the rope to lift buckets up the slope. With every inch of earth taken away, Eleanor felt as though she were reclaiming a piece of control she had lost the night Isaac died. This dugout was not built with purchased materials. It was made from every inch of soil she moved with her own hands. That was the most important thing. When the dugout chamber was finished, Eleanor began the stone front wall. That stage took nearly 2 weeks. She and Thomas walked down to the creek half a mile away, selected manageable stones, loaded them onto the old handcart, and pushed them back up the hill. The front stone wall was 2 feet thick at the base, tapering to 18 inches at the top to reduce load on the curved door. The main door she made 6.5 feet high and 4 feet wide, with a curved frame so snow would slide off to the sides rather than pile across when it drifted thick. 2 small windows, 1.5 feet square, were cut on either side, covered with oiled paper stretched over wooden frames, a cheap solution suited to the long haul from Yankton for glass. During the wall-building days, the south wind was gentle, prairie grass rustled, and the smell of wet earth and clay rose strong but pleasant. Eleanor set each stone with both hands. Bedding it in mud mortar, she mixed herself from clay and chopped straw, tamping firmly with a wooden stick, checking every crack. No stone was placed carelessly. Each position had a reason. With the front finished, she turned to the roof, the most complex part. Unlike the men in town, she could not hoist large logs for a flat roof. Eleanor had to think differently. She cut large willow branches near the creek, soaked them 24 hours to make them pliable, then bent them into long arches, forming 8 upright vault ribs, spaced 3 feet apart across both ends of the dugout. When 8 ribs were up, she connected them with horizontal stringers, creating the shape of an overturned boat, a natural structure that distributed weight evenly, much like the knowledge the Pawnee used for earth lodges. The roof was built in layers, first rough planks laid perpendicular to the arches, next a thick layer of clay mixed with straw, tamped hard, then oiled paper for waterproofing. Above that 12 inches of sod with intact grass roots. Finally, 2 feet of packed earth leveled to blend seamlessly with the hillside. When Eleanor stood on the roof and saw the entire structure merge into the hill as though it had always been there, she understood this was exactly what Isaac never had the chance to build. A roof the wind could not lift, could not tear, could not blow through. The dugout interior was finished in the last 2 weeks of summer. A stone bed platform topped with straw mattress, 2 wooden shelves fixed against the walls, a small cook stove connected to a clay chimney she made herself, a wood storage niche hidden behind a large boulder, and a deeper root cellar carved farther into the hillside to store food. In midsummer, when outside temperatures reached 80 degrees, the dugout held steady at 58 to 62 degrees stable, quiet, like the long, slow breath of the enveloping earth layers. No howling wind, no creaking walls, no sense of fragility. When Eleanor stepped into the completed dugout, she touched the cool earth wall and realized this was not a work of recklessness but of survival instinct. The narration closes this section with a simple truth. She did not build the house to be praised. She built it so winter would not take anyone else. From September through late November 1887, as the first seasonal winds swept the prairie like gentle warnings, the difference between Eleanor Ward's dugout and the town's remaining log cabins began to show not through dramatic events, but through everyday moments everyone saw yet no one wanted to admit. Townspeople came up to Ridge Hollow one by one, not to visit or help, but to observe what they still called in mocking jest, the widow's underground house. Henry Cobb came most often. He stood arms akimbo on the ridge, looking down at the low stone face of the dugout and shaking his head in dismay. That's not a house. That's a grave. Women passing on market days whispered just loud enough for Eleanor to hear through the oiled paper window. Where does light get in living in the ground? It's not even really cold yet, and she's already hiding down there. What about when the real storm comes? Reverend Dunn, in his Sunday sermon, alluded before the whole congregation. Man was made to stand on the earth, not to burrow like a beast. That remark caused several people to glance toward Thomas, sitting quietly in the last pew, but Eleanor only bowed her head, fingers tightening in her skirt, saying nothing. The words passed like wind, yet they lingered in the eyes of everyone who walked past her and her son. By early October, the dugout's silence began to stand in sharp contrast to the instability of the log cabins above ground. On nights when strong winds poured from the northwest, gusts raced across the prairie like invisible wolves chasing one another, carrying piercing howls. Log cabins shook with each blast, old joints creaking as though ready to burst. Myers's house lost its window shutter in one sudden cold night, boards rattling so hard they woke the whole family. The Duns' roof had to be hastily reinforced because wind suction tore loose a large north side section. But Eleanor's dugout did not shake, did not howl, did not sigh. No movement except the soft breathing of mother and son. Morning after each big wind night, smoke still rose steadily from the dugout's clay chimney while some cabins had to burn wood all night just to keep floors from freezing. Even so, that obvious fact did not change the townspeople's minds. They still believed in thick wooden walls and upright roof frames. They believed the dugout was warm only because the wind had not yet truly strengthened. They believed Eleanor was lucky. They did not believe in anything hidden beneath the earth, because to them a house had to stand up to the wind to be a house. The more she was watched, the more isolated Eleanor became. By October, she and Thomas were almost never invited to church gatherings anymore. No one said it outright, but the eyes that met hers when she entered made it clear their presence made people uncomfortable. Town children avoided Thomas. Some teased that he smelled like dirt from living underground. Thomas stayed silent, head down to hide sad eyes, but never complained to his mother. And Eleanor quietly prepared for the coming winter, drying wood into bundles, storing dried food in the root cellar niche, pounding clay to patch any leaking cracks, adding more straw and sod to the inverted boat roof. She did everything in the exact sequence her own experience and old Mrs. Nadawi's teachings had taught. Prepare not to fight the cold, but to live with it. November brought signs of an earlier, harsher winter than usual. Geese flew south in arrow formations a full week earlier than the previous year, calling in long, urgent waves as though urging one another to leave before the sky changed color. Prairie rabbits around the hill grew noticeably thicker, whiter fur, a clear signal of severe winter that anyone long in Dakota understood. But what caught Eleanor's attention most were the dull, throbbing headaches along her temples whenever the wind shifted direction or barometric pressure dropped suddenly, the same feeling she had known in the days before the storm that took Isaac. While everyone else busily boarded cabin windows with overlapping planks, Eleanor stood quietly at the dugout door, watching low clouds thicken day by day, the sky turning solid gray like stretched canvas. No one needed to say it. She knew a major storm was forming to the north, where cold Canadian air masses sometimes poured down and turned a Dakota winter into a life-or-death trial. But the town clung to old faith, that wooden walls and pitched roofs would withstand anything, that dugouts were fit only for wild animals, that someone like Eleanor was merely frightening herself because of past grief. Amid that blindness, the dugout grew even quieter, like a living body drawing itself in, holding warmth, waiting for the real wind to arrive. As November closed in deceptive calm, light wind over the hill and lowering skies signaled something abnormal. Townspeople walked the frozen dirt roads unaware that this winter would not resemble previous ones. No one knew that the very things they mocked, the earth layers, the sod, the inverted boat roof, would become the line between death and survival. The narration closes this section with an unemphasized truth. Simply stated, they believed in wooden walls, she believed in earth, and winter would decide who was right. The 12th of January, 1888, dawned with a strange light that any longtime Dakota resident recognized. The sky turned yellowish-gray like metal overheated then left in cold wind. The low cloud layer, thick and unnaturally still, resembled a giant blanket stretched taut ready to collapse. Wind shifted abruptly from south to northwest, carrying cold so sharp each breath felt like needles in the chest. Eleanor Ward stepped out the dugout door, looked north, and the smell of the wind made her shiver not from cold, but from recognition. "Big storm coming," she said, voice low but certain, as though confirming something earth and wind had already told her before others could notice. Without delay, she began preparations, bringing the few chickens inside near the stove for steadier warmth, adding dry wood to the left storage niche, filling 2 water barrels, checking the L-shaped entry that blocked direct wind blasts. Every action was slow, precise, unhurried, as though rehearsed many times in memory from the night Isaac died. As the sun sank behind the ridges, the sky suddenly turned ominous, purplish gray. Then in less than 10 minutes, wind from the northwest slammed down like a beast charging the prairie. No precursor gusts, no rumbling warning, just sudden switch from silence to chaos. On the surface, grass and blowing snow shot up in sheets. In the sky, snow streamed horizontally in white knife-edge bands. 60 to 70 mile-per-hour wind pounded the dugout front, producing heavy whumping sounds like falling stones, and the air turned solid white within minutes. Whiteout arrived so fast that 10 feet apart people could not see each other. Temperature plunged as though someone had opened a door to the polar regions. Within 1 hour, it dropped more than 22 degrees, from 12 degrees Fahrenheit to below 0 degrees Fahrenheit, then kept falling. The log cabins built on the surface took the first full blow. The Duns' roof lost a large section of tin right before supper. The metal screeched, then vanished into the vortex, panicking the household. Window covers were ripped outward, leaving gaps that sucked heat from the stove, dropping cabin temperature so fast, Mrs. Dunn had to wrap her 2 small children in 3 blankets and still heard them shivering uncontrollably. At the Myers house, the youngest daughter suffered frostbite to 2 fingers after only minutes opening the door to see how hard the wind blew. Fingers turned purple and numb, and they soaked them in warm water while wind rattled the shuttering windows. The Cobb house fell into the most dangerous state. Their woodpile was outdoors, and when wind tore the latch open, half the wood was scattered or buried under drifting snow. That first night, Cobb realized remaining wood could not last 2 days, let alone 3. Inside the dugout, all surface sounds arrived muffled. Wind still howled, but distant and heavy, like water falling beyond a cliff. The earth roof did not shake. Walls did not shift. No wood groaned or door banged. Temperature inside dropped slowly, from 52 degrees Fahrenheit to 47 degrees Fahrenheit in the first hours, then held steady at 44 to 47 degrees Fahrenheit, despite outside wind pulling cold below minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit. Eleanor added 2 small sticks to the stove, just enough to maintain gentle warmth without burning fuel too fast. She and Thomas sat close, listening to the storm like listening to the sea behind a rock wall. Above ground, every log cabin fought suction. North boards on the Duns' house rattled violently until Mr. Dunn braced them with 2 crossbeams, but wind was so strong cabin heat was pulled out in minutes. Myers, despite stuffing every crack with mattress cloth, could not stop wind shrieking through gaps. Wind did not merely pass, it swirled inside, circled rooms, pushed warmth to the ceiling, then dragged it out, forcing them to burn double the usual wood. At Cobb's, by midnight they broke a chair for emergency fuel. Wind from the northwest never paused, each gust rolling snow slabs off cabin roofs like dropping stones. The storm lasted all night, and by morning January 13, snow had built waist-high walls in front of the Myers house. Wind did not lessen, it strengthened. Eleanor cracked the dugout door to check wind direction. Blinding white light rushed in, then vanished as she shut it, leaving the dugout in familiar dim oil lamp gold. She said nothing, only set more food on the table and told Thomas to keep blankets close. The storm lasted 3 full days. By the second day, the Duns' log cabin lost nearly the entire north roof, forcing them to block wind with mattresses and quilts. Myers burned their grain bin when wood ran out. Cobb's family retreated to the kitchen, sealing off the other rooms because they were too cold. Throughout those 3 days, the dugout held temperature steady, varying only a few degrees, and the roof remained untouched despite more than 2 feet of drifted snow. Wind sound overhead was deep, thick, heavy like waves hitting rockshore. Not a single crack, not a single tremor. The buried structure remained as though the storm were happening in another world. When the 3rd day began, wind still showed no sign of stopping, but the dugout stood firm as when Eleanor set the first stone in the front wall. And in that contrast, earth standing still while wood broke, the distance between life and death became clearer than ever. On the night of January 13, wind held the same intensity as the previous night, showing no typical winter storm decline. Snow was driven into high wall-like drifts, nearly blocking the trail up Ridge Hollow. Inside the dugout, Eleanor and Thomas maintained steady warmth with a small stove fire, blankets wrapped tight to conserve wood. But amid the heavy whumping against the earth roof, another sound emerged, small, sporadic, like someone knocking with a fist on frozen stone. One knock, then silence. Two knocks, halting. Eleanor set down her spoon, signaled Thomas to stay put, and moved to the L entry. When she cracked the inner door, she heard clear light scratching on the outer wood. It took only seconds to realize it was not wind. When she opened the main door just enough, a body collapsed inward. It was Martha Myers, lips blue, hair and coat crusted with ice. Behind her, Winfred Myers and their two children, the youngest wrapped in a damp blanket that had lost nearly all warmth. "We couldn't keep the fire," Winfred gasped. Wind had torn the window cover away, sucking heat so fast they burned all wood and still could not stay above 10 degrees. The little girl's hands shook violently, every finger stark white early frostbite. Eleanor asked nothing more. She pulled them in, shut the door, and led them down the L slope so earth blocked wind noise. She settled them near the stove, gave blankets, and gave the children warm water sip by sip, as she had done dozens of times when Isaac lived. But before they could recover, a second knock sounded louder this time, pounding like stone thrown against wood. When Eleanor opened, wind gusted in carrying a sheet of snow, and in the dim lamplight she saw the Dunn family. Reverend Dunn, his wife, and 3 children huddled together, clothes stiff as boards from hours of wind-driven ice. Their roof had been partly torn off, leaving a gap that funneled cold straight inside. The Dunns had tried sheltering in the kitchen, but wind sucked smoke from the stove and extinguished the fire in minutes. When Reverend Dunn stepped in, his legs buckled, hands trembling so badly he could not hold his scarf. The children could not even cry because their lips were cracked open. Again, Eleanor said nothing. She drew them in, placed them near the Myerses, shared blankets, heated more water on the stove, positioned the smallest children in the least drafty spot. By then, the dugout held 8 people besides her and Thomas, but no one complained or questioned why she helped. The gap between outside cold and fragile inside warmth made questions pointless. They only knew the dugout was keeping them alive. Near midnight, as wind swung hard north, a third knock came faint enough almost to vanish in the storm howl, this time not pounding but dragging, like someone pulling a hand across wood. Eleanor opened very slowly, just enough to see Henry Cobb crawling on snow, hands clawing ground to drag himself closer. His face was bruised purple, mustache frozen in white clumps, each breath rasping because his lungs were deeply chilled. The man who once stood on the hill calling the dugout a grave now knelt before the door, body limp as rag. Eleanor gripped his thick coat collar, pulled firmly but steadily, then shut the door before wind blasted straight in. When she settled him near the stove, Mrs. Dunn wiped ice from Henry's face with a cloth, while Winfred Myers handed him a still warm blanket. No one mentioned his past words. No one needed to. Outside, wind still seemed ready to tear up the entire prairie, but inside, the dugout warmth was held by thick earth, vault structure, and the very thing they once mocked. Eleanor added a small pinch of wood to the stove, enough to sustain flame without overheating the dugout. The narrow space now contained 11 people. Her and Thomas, 4 Myerses, 5 Dunns, and Cobb. Their combined breath warmed the air slightly, holding temperature steady at 42 to 44 degrees warm enough to save someone hypothermic, to prevent children from frostbite, to restore adults feeling in hands and feet after hours. No one spoke it aloud, but all understood. The dugout was the only place standing against the storm, turning the whole town into a snow sea. Long after, when wind eased a little, Winfred Myers looked around the earthen room and whispered as though to himself, "We laughed at the only thing that could save us." No one answered, but the heavy silence in the dugout carried more meaning than any confession. There, beneath the ground they once considered lowly, their pride was buried as deeply as the log cabins collapsing outside in the storm's dark. By dawn, January 16, the final wind faded like the exhausted sigh of a spent beast. The storm did not end in one clear moment, but in an unnatural silence blanketing the Dakota prairie. The silence anyone here knew as the final sign of devastation. Snow stopped flying, but air remained frozen solid like shattered glass. Those sheltering in Eleanor's dugout waited nearly another hour. listening to the earth, listening to wind through door cracks, until certain the storm had truly passed. When they opened the dugout door, blinding white light flooded in, reflected off knee-deep snow that buried every trace of trail and fence. The prairie had no familiar shape. It became a blank plain, erasing boundaries between houses, trees, and banks. They climbed the earth steps out, stepping slowly like people rising from underground after an earthquake. What they saw was not snow, but destruction. The Duns' cabin retained only half its south frame. The north roof had been ripped away and carried off who knew when. Windows shattered, walls snapped like matchsticks. Myers's house was partly buried. Roof collapsed in crushing the kitchen where they had desperately tried to keep fire. Henry Cobb's cabin, built of thick logs he once boasted, good for 3 winters, now stood as bare skeleton, beams leaning like broken bones. 2 smaller cabins on the town edge, Sutter's and Wilkes's, had vanished completely beneath hard-packed snowdrifts like stone. In 3 days of relentless wind, the town lost what they believed symbolized strength: upright wooden walls facing wide sky. When survivors gathered in small groups amid the snow, their voices were chopped by cold wind. 7 people suffered severe frostbite, 3 lost fingers, 2 lost toes. 2 others showed early gangrene. The rest had purple faces, red eyes from snow glare and sleepless nights. But no one from Eleanor's dugout was injured. No one lost mobility. No one bore cold wounds, an almost unbelievable outcome when every above-ground cabin failed. As the dugout group stepped from the entrance, the remaining townspeople watched them with entirely changed eyes. No more disdain, no whispers or sneers, only stunned silence mixed with shame at a truth they could not deny. The dugout, the thing they mocked, scorned, was the only place wind never reached. A few drew closer, standing before the stone front. They touched the still warm wall, looked at sod roof fused to earth, intact, no sag, not one crack, not one fallen clod, not one warped beam. Everything remained as before the storm, as though the dugout had taken no part in the chaos that swallowed the prairie. Henry Cobb, once the loudest mocker of Eleanor, stood silent a long time before the dugout front. He did not speak at once. He bent, picked a small snow clump, squeezed it lightly, then let it fall. When he raised his head, the weathered face held no familiar arrogance, only a belatedly admitted truth. He looked at Eleanor, standing calm beside the entrance with eyes steady and hands still bearing traces of earth after 3 days tending the stricken, then said in a hoarse voice, "You understood the earth better than any of us understood the wind." That was not an apology. It was deeper, heavier, and in the silence covering Ridge Hollow, it became the dividing line between 2 worlds, one that once believed in wood and pride, and one that knew to bend and listen to what earth had whispered long before the storm arrived. Spring 1888 arrived later than usual, as though the prairie hesitated after the storm that stole part of the land's memory. But as the last thick snow shrank to silver streaks under weak sunlight, Ridge Hollow changed in ways no one imagined. 6 new dugouts rose along the hillside base, each facing south, each with curved vaults, thick sod roofs, packed earth covering identical to Eleanor's house. Those who once laughed at her now diligently measured soil, tamped earth, laid stone, asked how to mix clay with straw for waterproofing, asked what depth kept heat best. No one called dugouts beast dens anymore. No one joked about living underground. One late March morning, Reverend Dunn came to Eleanor's dugout. He stood long before the curved door, hat in hand, trembling slightly in still cold spring wind. When Eleanor stepped out, he bowed his head and spoke slowly, clearly. "Perhaps God wants us to live with the earth, not against it." Those words carried no defensiveness, only a belated admission for the whole town. In the weeks that followed, as snow melted to reveal fine soil and new grass shoots, the townspeople decided to erect a sign before her dugout. They set it on 2 sturdy posts, hand-carved with words everyone agreed on, even those who once opposed dugouts most fiercely. "Eleanor Ward she built with earth when we built with pride." No grand ceremony, no cheering, only the strange silence of people who had just passed through a winter that taught them pride can be colder than Dakota wind. On an afternoon when spring sun spread across the sod roof, Eleanor climbed the hill and stood on her own roof, where tender new grass was beginning to green again. Beneath her feet, earth warmed slowly. Small meltwater threads flowed down the slope like the land's fresh breath after recovery. She watched them run, gentle, steady, matching the rhythm. Winter withdrew from the prairie. The final narration lowers, quiet but penetrating like the earth that cradled the house through the storm. They laughed when she dug a house in the ground. But when Dakota's greatest storm struck, that very ground saved them. If you enjoy old frontier survival stories, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next episode. Thank you for watching. See you in the next journey through Dakota wind and snow.